Hello, everybody. I'm John Atack, and this is Kacey at the Cult Vault, and
Hi,
um,
everybody.
and here we are. And we last met in London at the CBS Reality Crimecon, where we entertained a room full of people together.
That's right.
Hmm.
That's right. And it went really well, and everybody had great things to say. And now I'm being labeled the resident cult expert of Crimecon. So
Wow.
I don't know how that's happened, but I think that that's partially thanks to you, John. So thank you very much.
Quite well. That's absolutely fine. Um, we'll see how we go with that. So, yes, you have a picture of a certain man that is used alongside the symbol of the cult vault,
That's
and
right.
it looks to me like it could be Charles Manson.
It is. I got asked whether it was Jesus Christ and whether it was Charles Manson. And somebody asked if it was actually me before listening to the show and thinking that I was a man. I don't know if that changed after they listened to the show. Who knows? But yes, it is. It's Charles Manson.
Well, I mean, curiously, Charles Manson at various times did claim to be Jesus Christ. So, there is some synchrony there, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe he was.
One hopes
Many
not.
people have claimed the same thing. And maybe one of them was telling the truth, but I'm not convinced at this point.
No, well, Karen de la Carrière told me that she was aware of at least 200 people who had claimed in a past life to be
Oh,
Jesus when she was running things for Scientology in Clearwater. So a couple of hundred of them out there.
oh my goodness. There's a
Um,
paper to be written there. There's like data to collect, I think, especially when you look at so many of the branches of new minor religions that kind of pop up all over the place and have many figureheads at the top that claim the same thing.
hmm, yeah,
So I just wonder if it's all linked. Well, of course it's all linked. I mean, and I feel like Scientology some of the times at the center of it, which could be said for the Charles Manson situation as well.
yes, and that's what led me to it. As you know, a month or so back, I did a show with Eric Hunley, and who's my chosen advocate of the slightly right. I've been looking for somebody to talk to that I don't actually agree with, but who's intelligent and is willing to have a conversation rather than picking up a megaphone and yelling obscenities. And Eric is the chosen one uh, in that regard. And he said after we talked that, did I know that my late friend Jolly West had pretty much programmed the Manson family? And my jaw dropped. Um, and so I went off, and he'd interviewed a guy called Tom O'Neill, who wrote a book called Chaos, which I bought a few years ago, but I didn't read it because it didn't have Scientology in the index. And writing about
Mm,
Charles Manson without mentioning Scientology is outrageous.
yeah.
And that led me down the rabbit hole. I'm now reading Jeff Gwynn's book. He mentions Scientology, but he doesn't have a clue what it is. And he thinks Dale Carnegie was the main influence on Charles Manson.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And that is what I got from reading Coming Down Fast and the section that focused on the Process Church as Manson's into Scientology. But once I listened to you break it all down, especially chronologically, I was like, it doesn't make sense any other way. And sometimes when there are conspiracy theories in play, you need that chronology laid out in front of you to be able to say, okay, yeah, there's nothing here.
Yeah, we have you have to be so careful because people will. I mean, the way O'Neill put it was that he said that Jolly West was his great white whale, and he was therefore pursuing him possibly in the same obsessive way that Captain Ahab.
Yeah.
He spent 20 years writing this book, and he's spent the last 2 years writing one about Jolly West. Now, Jolly West was a major player in the countercult field. He was a psychiatrist, was in the US Air Force and left the Air Force in 1954, was at university in Oklahoma there, gained tenure as a professor at a very young age. I think he was 29. And it came from a poor background and had taken the GI Bill to qualify. And he was already I think he first wrote about Hubbard while he was still in the Air Force in about 1952. I think he said something about him, and he was an important figure for the Cult Awareness Network before Scientology took it over. The American Family Foundation, now called the International Cultic Studies Association, he would be there at the conferences talking. He was sued by Scientology, and he won all of the suits. And at a meeting of the American Psychiatric Association, he stood up and said, Scientology is a cult, and
Wow.
L. Ron Hubbard's a quack, and I'm not going to be intimidated by them. So the thought that a man, he was also a friend of Martin Luther King, he took part in the civil rights movement, and it's not the portrait of a psychopath. Now, I only met Jolly 4 times. We spent hours together each time. We enjoyed each other's company. He was one of the most intelligent human beings I've ever met. I mean, he was really
Oh,
smart, you know?
yeah, that's saying something for you to say that, because I know many people often say that about you when they talk about intelligent people they know. So for you to say that, he must have been a very impressive individual.
Yeah, and he, I mean, somebody on Eric Hunley's channel said, I was taken in because he was attacking Scientology, and I was in denial, and um, he was charming, and psychopaths are charming. It's like, yes, but there are also charming people who are charming too.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if one looks carefully to what Robert Hare says about psychopaths, and believe me, I have looked carefully, I've read both of his books and been backwards and forwards through the Hare Psychopathy Checklist Revised, as it's snappily titled. And it's not that psychopaths are charming, they are superficially charming. And Jolly was absolutely consistently charming. And I went off and I've talked with a couple of people who knew him far better than I did. And with Joe Zimhart, for example, whose judgment I absolutely respect. Joe is a remarkable man. And again, one of the most intelligent people I've ever met. Remarkable man. And he worked with Jolly off and on over the years. And it's sort of, no, this idea that he's, it's being put forward by O'Neill that he was actually the architect of MK Ultra, the CIA mind
Mm.
control program, which had, I think, 149 projects, and was the very definition of evil, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
And so, he's being labelled this way. So it threw me into the Manson stuff, and what surprised me was that I wrote about Manson in Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky. He's in there. And that was first published in 1990. And I point out that he had 150 hours of
Yeah.
Scientology auditing. And this is glossed over in Jeff Gwynn's book. It's glossed over in the book you just mentioned, Coming Down Fast. There's no explanation of what Scientology is and how this might have been relevant. As to the process church of the final judgment, when I think I've got my dates right, he was studying Scientology in 1962 at McNeil Island Penitentiary. And I don't think the de Grimstons had moved to America yet by 62, had they? So,
I'm not 100% sure on dates, but I know that the majority of the earlier stuff takes place here as opposed to in the States. So that would make more sense if you're looking at Manson from sort of 67 to 68 before the horrific crimes take place. I mean, that we know of, because of course nothing good came before those dates either.
and Manson had, a life of criminality.
Yeah.
He certainly was a psychopath and not very charming, as far as I can tell. Um, but this rush to sort of evaluate his personality and see him as something, and say, well, I think all of the elements have to be taken into account.
Yeah.
The first is that he was an unwanted child. His mother
Yeah.
was 16 when she had him. She'd run away from a fairly strict, very strict religious household, She wanted to go out dancing and drinking. She fell pregnant. Um, Manson's not actually a Manson. His father was not called Manson. Um, and he disappeared. So, and she was too young. And I don't think, I've heard nothing nasty about her, save, of course, that, she went to prison for armed robbery. Um,
and sold him once for a pint of beer.
Well,
And
I've heard that one. I'm not totally convinced by that one, but apparently the arms in the armed robbery was a Coke bottle, and a guy was hit over the head with a Coke bottle, and
yeah,
he
yeah,
said time for
at a petrol station, at a
a service
or
station, as they
a
call them,
service station.
gas
Yeah,
station. Yeah.
yeah,
So but she seems to have tried to look after him as best she could, which you know, wasn't very well generally. She then married an alcoholic, and things just went downhill. So from the age of 12 to the age of 32, he was largely in institutions, one
yeah,
way and another,
yeah,
and has a dreadful background. If we look at the idea of abuse creating somebody dangerous, then Manson would be a candidate. But
yeah,
he he's a pimp, he's a car thief. Um, he was a small man. He was 5'5"
yeah.
and scrawny, and so I imagine that his time in institutions was not much fun. He talks about having been beaten up a great deal when he was in the Catholic reform school, which sound again something that wouldn't necessarily turn you into a good human being.
Yeah, yeah. Some of the abuses that are spoken about by other people that attended those same boy institutions sounds horrific as well. The abuse from staff and people that worked there.
Hmm.
So it's like a protection, like a life-saving mechanism to fall into certain behaviors. That's not to say that there isn't accountability, but there are lots of different elements to consider.
Hmm.
And that's why there's another conversation going on about whether um, Leslie Van Houten should be given parole, which she has been granted now. And so there's an interesting dialogue going on online about whether that's the right thing or not.
Has she actually been released because
I
the
saw
parole was
something
stopped?
today. Yeah, I saw something, a news article today on CBS that talked about how the judge is stepping down from um, withholding the pending parole hearing. So that's the same person that denied the request for parole or reversed
Yeah,
the
the earlier judgment.
permitted parole. Yeah, yeah. So it looks like it's going to happen in the next few weeks. I'm sure there'll be an announcement. So it's been some years, and that's pretty big news in terms of coercive control, at least. I mean, I know you love that phrase.
Well, yeah, because it kind of over eggs the pudding. Coercion need not be involved in coercive control. So, because coercion means force, intimidation, or threat, and
Yeah,
our whole point has been that you can bend somebody to your will without using force, intimidation, or threat. Indeed, the whole idea of the Coercive Control Act was in this country in 2015 was to say that there doesn't have to be physical violence involved. So that's the force element of
yeah,
coercion, but intimidation and threat aren't necessary either. And the Manson case, I mean, you've got Manson, Patty Hearst, and Jonestown. When I got involved in this way back in 1983, those were the three proofs, if you like, that mind control existed, that brainwashing was going on. I have a more nuanced view now than I did then. And with Manson, that is the question. The idea is that he brainwashed a group of young women and young men, all younger than him. Indeed, some of the youngest of the girls that he picked up and took into the family was 14 years old.
yeah,
And he took these people who were impressionable, he ruled and dominated them, and he then got them to commit these murders. Now, I get right up to the point of got them to commit these murders, and I go, hang on, this is a bit more complicated. Let me say that my
Yeah.
perspective is, if you commit a crime, then you are responsible for what you did. I do not believe in any zombie state where somebody is completely under the control of another person. There are then mitigating circumstances. If, for example, you committed the crime because members of your own family were being threatened or
Yeah,
tortured.
that's what comes to my mind when I think about kind of, what lengths or what reasons would some people have for following through with things. And I was thinking, if somebody had my kids, I don't know what I would
Hmm.
do in that situation.
Well, I'd kill the person who'd got my kids, even though I'm totally against capital punishment, of course. But this question of where the responsibility lies becomes so difficult, and so the assessment has to be very careful. The murders were horrific. The Sharon Tate murders at Roman Polanski's house. Um, they're just horrifying. The details of them. Manson wasn't there when they happened. Manson wasn't there when any of the murders happened.
No, no. Oh,
But
briefly with Gary Hinman, and I feel like that is poignant because the whole hanging around and trying to stitch up the face with teeth in floss and things, and keeping him in the house as he deteriorated into a state of infection and whatever else. Um, I don't know if that kind of well, and I mean, and Chris Shelton told me there's no point thinking or talking in hypotheticals, but I wonder how different the situation would have been if Manson didn't show up with some type of samurai sword.
yeah, and he begins that, what happens there. He leaves before Hinman's death.
Yeah.
And, Manson, in the book that he did with Noel Lemons, which, and, Jeff Gwynne says of this book that he believes that Noel Lemons accurately reported what he was told. And I'd go along with that, which makes it a valuable document, because in dealing with Ron Hubbard in his past, I don't just dismiss his past because he was a liar. I look at everything he said and see how it fits together, and often it will point towards the truth. Liars do that. So, for example, when Hubbard claimed to have been crippled and blinded, he said that he had physical injuries to hip and back. Now, somebody who's making a story up might put that word physical. The rest of us think injuries to hip or back. That's fair enough. So he's sort of saying, you might think I'm lying. They were physical injuries. They weren't pretend
Yeah.
injuries. And they were, the injury to his back was that he'd fallen down a ship's ladder. So there was some slight grain of truth, but it wasn't really a combat wound, exactly, falling down a ladder. So
Maybe just to his ego.
yeah, which was massive, let's face it. And with Manson piecing everything together from what he says, he basically says that he deserved to be in prison for the rest of his life for the conspiracy to commit murder, which he accepts. But he does not accept that he directed these killings. The idea is that once Bobby Beausoleil had been picked up, quite rightly, for the
Yeah.
Hinman killing, that somebody came up with a scheme, and Manson says it wasn't him, to do a copycat. And because blood had been used to smear words on the wall, they
Yeah.
thought, we'll do the same thing. So that's a part of it. The other part of it is, to what extent did Manson control them, and to what extent 50 and more years later should people still be in prison for these offences? And I think it's an awfully long time, and we should be looking at whether these people have in fact rehabilitated themselves, or been rehabilitated. and whether they are, of course, any danger to society, which seems pretty unlikely now.
Yeah. I mean, well, Manson's dead now. He died in 2017, 16, 17.
Yeah.
So that must play a part in, if you're worried about the person that was supposedly controlling everything and setting the narrative and the actions and the outcome, has no more say, if she was to get released and they're worried that there's still an element of obedience or connection to him, that wouldn't exist anymore. But I mean, 50 years of no contact with a person probably severs that tie of the stark reality of being incarceration or incarcerated. I imagine does that pretty swiftly.
Yes, absolutely. And Manson, of course, to his own, what seems to be his own amazement, held sway over thousands of people outside of prison because people were volunteering to help him and to do things. And, so as to how much influence he might have had, but so if he was, and he certainly was the leader of this group of people, there's no doubt about that. There seems to have been a massive influence over the young women involved. Again, O'Neill didn't have, and I don't think Jeff Gwynne had access to Manson the Lost Tapes, which is a vital document. A week after Manson was arrested, a movie maker went to Spahn's ranch, where the remainder of the family were, or most of them, and filmed. I think there are 5 girls involved. And you see that the kind of state they're in, and it's very persuasive to say, that they are, under some kind of influence, because they're sat there with assault weapons. They've all had buzz cuts, and they're
Of course, yes, because they were training for this and doing sort of round the clock watches and
yeah,
with weapons. And I'd completely forgot all about that part.
and they're waiting for helter skelter. They're waiting for this moment when the black population will rise up, which was something, I think in 1967 there were, I've recently read, 130 race riots in the United States in that year. So race riots were as common as school shootings are now.
Yeah, it's if you needed something to motivate people, it's easier to use that thing than the actual end of the world apocalypse, floor opening up underneath you.
Mm,
It's like,
it's
yeah,
actually
school shootings.
going on, and of course Manson had been brought up racist, which is sadly still happening in some parts of the world. But the institutions he was in, I mean, one of the telling things is, of course, whenever he was sent to prison, the prison would be segregated. The black prisoners were not considered good enough to spend time with the white prisoners. We're talking, he comes out of prison just as, well, he's in there as the modern civil rights movement is finally making some ground. But he lives in an incredibly divided society. And Jeff Gwynne says that he didn't actually say anything racist in front of the girls because they didn't like it, which is a weird thought. So he was completely in control of their minds, but he didn't say anything that would upset them.
Yeah, that's strange to think about when you consider, horrifically raping 14-year-olds and dragging people out into Death Valley because he envisioned a wolf and then thought he was a wolf for a little while. And I don't know. And then keeping people up round the clock,
Hmm.
but not saying things that might upset them. It's strange. What if somebody would have turned around and said, "I don't like the Beatles"? I don't know. Maybe that's a step too far.
Well, he actually in Without Conscience says that he wasn't that keen on the Beatles, and he's one of he says he liked Perry Como and Frank Sinatra, and probably did it his way as well. Um,
Yeah, didn't Frank Sinatra's name end up at the top of the hit list that they found at Sparns Ranch after they arrested him?
that's
My
so
idol. He's at the top
unfair.
of my hit list. Yeah.
So unfair. You know, of course, Nancy Sinatra's "These Boots Were Made for Walking" was played at Waco repeatedly in a heavy volume. Um,
Oh
where
gosh.
somebody challenged me a couple of years ago and said, you know, Jolly West was working with the CIA, and Waco, that's Jolly West. He was involved with that. And I said, actually, I was with him that week in Los Angeles, or more than a week, the Waco siege, but I was during the Waco siege, I saw Jolly. And yes, indeed, he was calling the FBI up and saying, what you're doing is entirely stupid. So, yeah, he tried to be involved in Waco. But so, yeah, the Manson, the difficulty that I particularly have is that once we've determined that we hate somebody, then we will attribute to them all of the characteristics of a hateful person. And so Jeff Gwynne, whose book I think I think O'Neill's book is very well researched and very well written. Jeff Gwynne's book is well researched and well written, but he attributes characteristics to Manson. You know, so he says, for example, that Manson never did anything for anybody. He only ever did things for himself. And you're going, well, yes, that's an attribution. That's not. And there are many places where he, you know, I'm looking to the back of the book for the reference to tell me he said Manson felt this or said this or did this, and there's no reference. This is, you know, I'm not being told where this information comes from.
Right.
And it isn't quite as cut and dried as, you know, the FBI would have us believe with regard to, say, serial killers, that their behaviors are nuanced. Jeffrey Dahmer is a really strong example of that, that he appears to have felt remorse, and psychopaths don't. So that's not possible. So let's write it out. So I think often people kind of, they want to say this is the recipe without having actually properly deconstructed the meal. They don't know how it was made.
Right. Right.
With Manson, the elephant in the particular room is that none of the biographies that I've looked at, and with the one you provided to me earlier today, that's 3 that I've looked at outside of his own autobiography, and you know, so many articles over the years, they don't tell us what Scientology is and why Scientology might have had some part in this. So my understanding is that by the time he got to McNeil Island in 1962, Manson's spent most of his life in institutions. He's the little guy. He's picked on. He's beaten. He's attacked. He says that he was homosexually raped at the Catholic boys' school. Sadly, we know that that would not be at all unusual. You know, the Australian Royal Commission found that 500 Catholic priests in Australia had abused 8,000 victims. We've recently, in Portugal, I think in January, 4,000 victims. So this has been a, you know, just a terrible plague, and Manson was subjected to this. But how is he going to survive? So he does much of Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People course. He drops out of the course, but there's something odd going on. He says that he only learned to read and write in 1962. Jeff Gwynne points out that his reading and writing had been graded before in the system, and that he could read and write, but he could only read and write to a pretty basic level. He's 27 by the time he's in McNeil and learning to read and write, supposedly. And he then suddenly says that he starts reading voraciously. He has people send Scientology books to him. He meets Lania Raymer. Lania Raymer is, according to Scientology's internal documents, which none of these authors seem to have dug out, which surprises me because they've been in my possession since 1983. You know, because they came out when the FBI raided Scientology, the largest raid in their history, in July 1977. They brought out this material about Manson. And this material was what's called red box material in Scientology. In the Guardian's office, the harassment division of Scientology, any material that must not be taken by the police was put into a red box. And each office had a red box. And if the alarm went, you destroyed the red box. They got the red boxes. And in one of the red boxes was material on Manson. This includes a so-called compliance report written to Ron Hubbard's wife, Mary Sue Hubbard, who was the controller of the Guardian's office, with an amazing amount of detail about Charles Manson, basically saying that material is blowing up about the process and its relationship to Scientology and about Manson, and they want to keep it out of the news. What's particularly, to me, startling about this detailed report is that it goes to Mary Sue Hubbard a month before the Manson trial begins.
Oh.
They're on it straight away. And in there, we find that Lania Raymer is in prison because he was robbing a bank to have enough money to pay for his Scientology. We're told that he's a class 1 auditor, level 1. At that time, that would have meant that he had done the Hubbard Qualified Scientologist course, the first major course in Scientology. He would have done the Hubbard Standard Dianetics course, possibly, though things are a bit up in the air as to from one year to the next as to what Scientology, there was no bridge of Scientology in 1962. That's still being put together. But he would probably very likely have also been a word clearer, and he will certainly have done the class 0 course. So you have a guy who's done a certain amount of Scientology, and then in the pack, we have an affidavit written by Lania Raymer saying, I was never a minister of Scientology. I had no, I did this on my own. It's nothing to do with them. So again, they're really keen to not be identified. So
Right.
when 3 weeks ago, Steve Hassan, in his column in Psychology Today, mentioned that Charles Manson had had 150 hours of auditing, Scientology was straight on it. And they produced a 1971 newspaper article from The Guardian here in Manchester saying that the libel that they'd been involved with Manson had been withdrawn. This is a little disingenuous, as they know that their internal documents show otherwise. And given that they sued me over my book, which mentions this but didn't sue me for saying that, suggests that they know that they have no ground to stand on. But they don't want to be, they don't want to be positioned against Charles Manson. And it's probably fair to say, if you say, well, Charles Manson was an Anglican, or Charles Manson was a Baptist, or Charles Manson was a Muslim, or what have you, so what, frankly?
Yeah.
But Scientology is a little bit prickly. And then we go, well, in this report, it says he spent 14 months, at least, doing Scientology. He had 150 hours of auditing. If you think about that and we shouldn't, but if you think about it in terms of therapy hours, that would be the equivalent of having 3 sessions a week for a year.
Wow, that's a lot. That is a significant amount of time studying L. Ron Hubbard's work, because
Well,
that's what he did. He studied. It wasn't just taking part in the courses. It was understanding how he could use that outside of the well, within the prison as well, but outside of the prison, much with the how to make friends and influence people, or how to win friends and influence people.
yeah, I said something polite about Dale Carnegie in a talk the other week, and having gone and looked at him again, I want to withdraw that. He was a manipulative bastard, and that's all there is to it. And surely Manson did learn something from there, but to then, how to win friends and influence people is about becoming a salesman, or a salesperson, and it's not really pleasant, because it is about conning people into liking you. and that's really fundamentally psychopathic. But there's that. It's a kind of set of sales techniques. Scientology, by its own admission, is a way of teaching you how to control other people.
Yeah.
And it's put to you as if that was a good thing, that you don't have enough control over the people around you. This isn't just selling people on something. It's not just getting them new double glazing or a set of pots and pans or a Hoover. This is how to control somebody else's
Right.
mind.
It's like a double bind in that way. I can imagine Manson strolling up and down the beach, finding young, vulnerable women who are in emotional states and selling them something. And once they're kind of interested, then the other pieces come into play that result in totalistic control of people's lives.
Mm. Except let's add one other thing. 3 other members of the family were also Scientologists.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah.
So who's controlling who and how? But
Yeah.
the the thing is that we are talking about 150 hours of so-called auditing, plus whatever reading time he did, plus whatever study time he did. Now, from a Scientologist point of view, it's actually in the memorandum to Mary Sue Hubbard that he'd done training routine 0. Now, that would be considered separate from any auditing. You are meant to do it for some hours, and you do it again and again and again. My first 9 months involved with Scientology, I did training routine 0 every day
Oh my gosh.
because it replaced Zazen meditation, which is what I'd been doing every day before that.
Right.
And I could never really see what the particular difference was, why this was thought to be anything different. Specifically, there's a meditation called a Tratak meditation, which Hindus do, where you sit and look at another person. So I was talking with the head of investigation in Scientology back in 1993, and I said to her, so this TR0, the fact that the Hindus in some sects use it, that would be considered squirrel, and you'd have to abolish it. You'd have to stop them from doing it. And she said, absolutely. So anything that Hubbard stole from anywhere is ours now, and people must stop doing it immediately. But
It's got this different name, so you'll never link it back to another place or another person's ideas.
just unbelievable when you trace down Hubbard's ideas. That I went looking for correspondences between his ideas and other people's, and there's a great guy called Jeff Jacobson who'd written a paper on Hubbard's plagiarism, and he'd shown techniques that belonged elsewhere and ideas that belonged elsewhere that Hubbard had used. I then went a step further, which was to connect Hubbard to the source of those things.
Wow.
So to show that it was genuine plagiarism. It wasn't just that he'd come up with the same idea. In fact, the major source, and there's a scholar called David Barrett, a PhD, who's written several books. And in one of them, he says that although Hubbard was involved with Crowleyite magic, there's no evidence of Crowley's teachings in Scientology. I found 60 of Crowley's ideas in Scientology. So I disagree with that point of view, that it's not practiced as a form of ritual sex magic. Yes, that's true. That's absolutely true. But things like the trauma of birth, Crowley talks about. Indeed, the first of the training routines, called Beginner's Training Routine 0 now, comes directly from Crowley, where you sit with your eyes closed opposite to a person. Steve Hassan and I, with Chris Shelton and Christian Churko, analysed these techniques, and there's a video on my channel showing what the training routines do. What's of particular interest to me, is we know that Manson did what are called objective processes, control communication havingness processes, which are an interesting little set of techniques that include mimicry. So you'll have somebody follow your hand, for example. These are hypnotic inductions. They're ways of getting somebody it's called pacing by some hypnotists. It's a way of getting somebody to react in sync with you.
Right.
So that it's done with breathing. And let me really underline that I have never trained in hypnosis. I have never knowingly practiced hypnosis, because I realized when I came out of Scientology, I'd been trained in hypnosis for 9 years, and I really didn't want to do it. So while my friends went off and did neuro-linguistic programming and things like that, I just watched them and what happened to them, and read, what Bandler and Grinder or Milton Erickson had to say, and sought to develop an understanding of what was actually going on and how to undo it, rather than doing more of it to people, which
Yeah.
is very much what Scientology is. But so you have these procedures, and that would have included opening procedure by duplication, which is where you have a little card table at either end, in this case of your cell, at the other end of a room. And on one table you have a book, and on the other you have a bottle. And the person is marched up and down between them, and you're commanded. The Hubbard uses the word command. You don't question people, you order them to do things, which made me a little bit suspicious at the time and has made me a lot more suspicious since. You have auditing commands. And so you say, look at that, standing at one side, you say, look at that bottle, walk over to that bottle, pick the bottle up, what's its temperature, what's its weight. Each time acknowledging that the person has done this, you say, thank you, or fine, good, all right, what have you, to complete the cycle of communication. And you do this for as long as it takes. I, very early on learned how to do this, and thankfully didn't have to do it a lot of times, but I did do 5 2-hour sessions with this guy.
Oh gosh.
And it is mind numbing.
Oh.
You dissociate, you don't know what's going on anymore. And the idea is that you will be exterior from your body. And of course, by the time you're done with it, you're kind of nowhere near your body, you're all over the place. You don't know what's going on. Sadly, in all of these years now, nearly 50 years, I've yet to have a reliable report of anybody leaving their body and being able to perceive anything. In fact, very few people have even claimed that they could do it, of the 1,000 or so that I've talked to. But Manson will have done this, and there will have been this idea, fundamental ideas of Scientology. One is being exterior to your body. Another is reincarnation, which we do know that Manson believed in, because he talked about it, and seemed to believe he was in fact Jesus.
Yeah.
And I think he gave Jesus a pretty bad name by claiming that personally. It's just not nice. But then you have this notion of control. In Scientology, it's called infinite control. And Hubbard had a real penchant for taking the number 8 and representing infinity, which of course the infinity symbol does look like an 8. It's not actually an 8, but there are books, 8.8008, 8.80, 0.8. He was very keen on the number 8. And that could be something to do with Aleister Crowley too, but who was also quite keen on the number. But we have this idea of 8C, which runs throughout Scientology from very early on. This is infinite control. And this is where you are able to intend another person to do something and get them to do it. We don't know, but it's extraordinarily likely that Charles Manson did what are called the upper indoctrination training routines. So they're numbered from 6 to 9. And
Are they called upper indoctrination?
they are
Are they
called the
the words?
upper indoctrination training routines in the Hubbard Communications Office bulletin that lays them out. Yeah. He also talked of auditing, which of course is something you do to your books to see if your receipts balance. He called it processing, which is a word that always bothered me throughout my membership. So in the upper indoctrination training routines, you take physical control of somebody. You actually do things that are, in this generation, considered excessive. You physically grab somebody by the shoulders and move them across the room. And you are learning, according to Hubbard, to teach the person that their reactive mind can be controlled. because you on the outside are controlling it and stopping it from doing all the horrid things that reactive minds do to us. And that will show you that you will be able to control it. Elsewhere, he talks a great deal about control. And he says, for example, there's no such thing as bad control. Control is always good. Yeah. Which was an idea I
Oh,
had problems with, I must say. So these drills teach you how to push your way through, how to get somebody to do what you want to do. Now, there's a particular thing that Manson is known for, and that's the 1,000-mile stare. And I haven't seen anybody in writing about Manson point out this is what training routine 0 is. You are trained to make locked on eye contact with everybody at all times. And it's one of the ways you can tell if you have a Scientology agent in your life.
yeah. I'd find that so like disconcerting, I think. I mean, eye contact, but not like, oh, just somebody that just stares and doesn't break eye contact.
Well, and in Scientology, you're being told that this puts people at their ease so you can counsel them. But in the
Right.
police and the military, it's called the predatory stare. And
Yeah,
it's taught as a
I
way of
like
hassling.
I think that's how it would make you feel. It's interesting and makes sense that Scientology would pitch it that way. You know, this is a positive thing when actually it's probably more likely to show you who can be submissive pretty quickly, you know, like kind of head down, not making eye contact, avoiding like any type of it just feels I don't know, I think it would feel intimidating. So if somebody's gonna do things to hide away from that intimidation, I think I would do that, then I might be susceptible to some of the other things that could then be brought in um to begin influencing.
Hmm. I mean, it's something that is seen that cats do it. They'll sit and stare at something. You know, they'll get locked onto it. And we know that rabbits freeze in the headlights. So there is a sort of
Right.
relationship in nature that's going on here. It took me, because I had 9 years of practicing this. And so in normal everyday conversation, while I was smart enough to understand that Scientologese as a language was not going to be understood by non-Scientologists, so I kept a separate vocabulary. And of course, I was never a living member, so I was out in the world anyway. But I hadn't worked out that the locked on eye contact would be distressing to people, which is weird. I was 19 when I got involved, and so I had 9 years of doing it. And when I left and decided that the only safe thing to do was reject everything,
Right.
there wasn't a way of looking at it through itself. I did try that. And so I had to reject everything and say, I'll take back any bits that make sense later on. I'll take back. I haven't taken back anything. I found better sources for any decent ideas in Scientology, and most of the ideas are counterfeit. When you push them hard, they don't work. Um, and but it took me 6 months after I'd left to stop staring at people,
Gosh.
even though I knew it was a bad thing to be doing. And the most incredible thing about it was that when it finally went, I realized that I noticed far more about people than I had done when I was staring at them. Now, there's a reason for that. It's called the Ganzfeld effect. And that is that if you fixate perception in any way, then the brain starts to fill in information. You get feedback in the system. So if you stare at a white wall, you'll start to see colors drifting down the wall. If you stare at somebody's face, it will distort after a few minutes. If you stare at anything, the easiest way of checking it is in a dark room. In a completely dark room, if you sit in the middle of a dark room, within 10 minutes, you will hear things.
Oh, that's creepy. I don't even want to try it.
No, and it's once you understand what it is, and then you go, oh no, mindfulness. meditations, all of these things that are being taught to people based on very little or no scientific evidence. I mean, Miguel Farias, who co-wrote the Buddha Pill, and who's at Oxford University, and by now should have released the Oxford Handbook of Meditation, which would be like, the Oxford Handbook of Hypnosis is the big book on hypnosis. So he is a scholar, and he's a mindfulness practitioner, and he admits to having become a mindfulness junkie, his word, and he says that having had his students check, I think it was 3,000 studies of mindfulness, only 38 of them were viable studies. The rest were all didn't fit the criteria for study.
It's like 1%. 1% was viable.
Yeah, just over. And so he's sort of going, his words are, there is no robust scientific evidence to support mindfulness, while the National Health Service had already adopted it here for depression and anxiety, for which it will not be helpful, because self-reflection is not what you need. You need to be taken out of yourself if you're feeling anxious or depressed. Fairly simple. But so we have Manson learning this technique, and we know 3 other members of the family, because this is the first thing you learn in Scientology. This is the communication course. This is the beginning. So they will have been aware of this. They will have been using this. And if you want to command somebody's attention, then these techniques are effective. They're meant to be effective. And so if you then add certain things to them, isolation, a milieu, a group of people who all agree on something, sleep deprivation, drug abuse. We know that the family were using LSD. Gary Hinman there were 2 different accounts, actually. One says that he was making synthetic mescaline, and the other that he was making methamphetamine. And both may be true. I don't know. But these are drugs that can affect people's concentration a little bit, and their locus of control, their sense of being in control. In fact, they can seriously affect it. O'Neill goes to the point that it's LSD that's been used to brainwash these people. And you're going, well, that's not what the CIA's MK Ultra says about LSD. They say it's a great drug for confusing people. But if you want to program somebody, and indeed in Scientology, the drug that was singled out by Hubbard as something that Scientologists must not use was LSD. I had 2 sources, people he'd told that he'd used LSD. In fact, one was somebody who said he'd taken it with him. And he was a bit notorious in terms of his drug use, by his own confession. He'd used amphetamines and barbiturates, and he said he'd been addicted to barbiturates in a lecture. So we know that Hubbard was using these drugs. So he was knowledgeable about their effects. LSD was forbidden, and I'm pretty sure it's forbidden because it can cause a sudden shift of perception. And you don't believe stuff anymore. So if you're carefully trying to program somebody, this would be the last drug you would use. If you wanted to confuse them, if you wanted to control them in the short term, yeah. But to get them to be kind of robot slaves, this would not be the drug you'd use. The drug you'd use for that would be Datura. And curiously, O'Neill doesn't mention Datura at all. And Jeff Gwynne doesn't mention Datura at all. Charles Manson mentions it. He misnames it. He says it's belladonna. And he talks about something called Talache tea. Now, weirdly, Jolly West was asked, Steve Hassan and I saw Jolly, I think in 91 in LA. And just out of the blue, Steve asked him, what do you think the Manson family were taking? And he said straight away, Jimson weed. Now, Jolly was a leading expert on drugs. I think demotivation on cannabis, people who are basically using too much cannabis, I think he was the first person to identify it back in the 60s. And he just straight away Jimson weed. Now, Jimson weed is Datura. It's one of the various forms of Datura. And this drug is incredibly potent. I was very lucky. I remembered that around the same time that Steve and I met Jolly, Steve had introduced me to a friend of his who's an ethnobotanist. And so I got hold of Steve, and it's like, you remember 30 years ago, this friend of yours? And he said, yeah. And can I have an email? And this wonderful man, and I'm not going to name him because why should I, given the possibilities here. This
Yeah,
wonderful,
yeah.
wonderful man, within 24 hours, had got a description of Tolo Ache. The reason I couldn't find Talache was because Manson had misunderstood the word. Well, that's Scientology and getting a misunderstood word. Tex Watson, who's went to prison for the Tate murders and the LaBianca murders, he talks about it too, Talachi tea. And Manson says he didn't take it, but he said he never, from the first time that Watson took it, he never saw him other than under the influence of this drug. Now, this is a special drug. It's called a deliriant. It's in a separate class to the hallucinogens. It doesn't just distort the environment around you, which is what LSD, psilocybin, mescaline will do. It puts you into a nightmare. And from what I hear from people who've taken ayahuasca or ibogaine, these two are deliriants. They put you into another world. A friend of mine years ago said that he took ayahuasca and angels talked to him. It's, would I like some? And it's like, no, I don't think I would. Thank you very much. It's lovely of you to ask, but I've talked with
Yeah,
enough angels.
I think I read part of Manson's journey. He sat down and said, well, he said he sat down with an Indian chief and tried ayahuasca. Whether that's true or not, you know, because cult leaders tend to, to say things that sound quite impressive to certain people, but don't necessarily hold up. But
Well, Carlos
I've read
Castaneda, prince among them all, what a bullshit artist he was.
that there's so many things that you read that Manson claims, like post final imprisonment, that I just think um don't line up. But the accounts of people that contributed to Simon Wells's coming down fast and Tex Watson's reactions to being under the influence of that drug, horrific. The things that he was saying and the experience he had, and it was like 4 or 5 days of him like wanting to, like asking to die, and having horrific experiences, and then having a huff jar of methamphetamines that Manson apparently, and I don't know again because I'm not a historian of anything, um forbade people from taking methamphetamines, and I don't know if that's true. But Tex Watson hid a huffing jar that he would, before going out to murder people, would huff from this jar and then kind of be in a completely different psychological state when driving to Cielo Drive than he was laying around on the ranch, just like not even able to stand up.
Yeah, I mean, and it's the, if Datura was, well, and both Watson and Manson say Datura was involved, then you're dealing with a drug that gives you a 3-day trip, and takes you out of reality. So your whole sense of what you're doing, it's like there's this old saw that you can't get somebody to do under hypnosis something they wouldn't do normally, and this, it just repeated again and again and again, and you go, well, okay, this is a toy gun, go and shoot somebody with it. So you don't have to cross that moral barrier. And as Derren Brown has demonstrated twice now, you can make a Manchurian Candidate. You can make some, he had, in one of them, he had Stephen Fry on stage and he had somebody in the audience shoot him. And the guy who's shooting him had no idea why he'd done it. So, but that's a very quick form of programming. And I've spent far too much time studying terrorism over the years. And a lot of the texts are not reliable. That's my conclusion, because the people didn't actually bother to spend any time with terrorists. They, you know, why do that when you can get a
Yeah.
grant to not have to? Because they're horrible people. You don't want to meet them. But when you look at the work of Ariel Marari, who is in Tel Aviv and I think affiliated with Yale, he spent more than 20 years talking with failed suicide bombers. And what's evident is you can program to do something. You can program somebody to kill themselves and to kill others. Suicide bombers have been routinely trained to do this. But when you get into the small print, you find that the bombers themselves tend to be teenagers, they tend to be young. Palestinians say that they won't recruit anybody under the age of 17, which is nice. But they'll be young, and there'll be 3 days between recruitment and death. Because this is, so maintaining somebody, the idea is that the family from the very beginning, run by Jolly West, who may have met Manson, walked the same corridors as O'Neill's, is as far as O'Neill manages to get in terms of proof. For 2.5 years, he was in some way, according to O'Neill, therefore, running the family, which is a ridiculous assertion. So these kind of short-term, getting somebody to do something horrific, yes, it can be done. And if you then have put them onto a drug, given them a drug where they don't realize what they're doing. Historically, we have the berserkers, people who were given drugs to then be sent into battle because they didn't care what they did anymore. And the most usual drug for that effect, of course, is alcohol, as it is also the most usual date rape drug by far. So we do have an elephant in the room there. But in this case, we have these convergent factors that say a lot of things went wrong. If we look to before the Hinman murder, you have Crow, the very large 300-pound black drug dealer who Manson shoots and thinks he's killed.
Yeah.
And the next day, there's news that a Black Panther's been killed. And Manson knows what that means because he left 2 witnesses. It means he's finished. And that would explain, that's in the July, that would explain why things get ramped up and that Manson is now entering a paranoia where he's kind of in fear of for his own life. And the idea is that because Bobby Beausoleil's been arrested, they will do copycat killings and off they'll go. But this does seem to have been a decision made within the group.
I've read versions of, well, that there's so many different things out there, but in the Simon Wells biography, it does talk about how Tex Watson and I don't want to say which of the women it was because I can't remember specifically, go to Manson and propose the idea.
Yeah.
I think it might have been Sadie, but I don't know. And that's been corroborated by a number of different people. So it kind of it's but then there are infamous lines that Manson is known for when they're leaving, and he says something like make it look convincing. I mean, it's not those words, but so it's hard to pull everything apart.
Well, I think what you say is vital, that the idea doesn't appear to have come from him. He then goes along with it wholeheartedly and of course plants evidence. After the Tate murder, he goes to the house and plants a pair of spectacles there for some reason to confuse people.
And they're found they're found under the fridge or something, and police think that they belong to one of the people that was living there. So yeah, it's so many things go wrong. The bicycle, well, not bicycle, the biker gang that Bobby Beausoleil became involved with before, which led to the Gary Hinman fiasco, was a whole element. The illegal chop shop that they were running, stealing cars, breaking them down. The most it's like Occam's razor. When you're looking at this conspiracy theory that Manson and the Manson family were part of the MK Ultra mind control experiment, which we know happened, but
Mm,
not in this context.
mm,
Occam's razor tells me that there were multiple law enforcement agencies working across the Cielo Drive incident. uh, there's another police division trying to locate where all of these cars are going. And there's another police division looking at Spahn's ranch because there's weird activity
mm,
happening and people are driving cars but don't have driving licenses. And then there's everything happening in Los Feliz at the Leno and Rosemary LaBianca property. None of these people are communicating, and it's only when, by chance, two of those people do, that it all comes together.
mm.
So to me, when I read it that way, that makes the most sense to me, instead of chance interactions between two individuals like Jolly West and Charles Manson. Um, and I'm sure for some people that can sound convincing enough. That's why we have conspiracy theories around Jonestown being part of some CIA memory mind manipulation program. Sometimes I think people find conspiracy theories easier to understand than the horrific truth of things. And in this case, if law enforcement were communicating or working differently, there's a chance that less people would have died, and that you know breaking down cars was the the worst crime that could have happened,
Mm.
without looking at the actual abuse that was taking place to the family members themselves.
Yes, absolutely. And I think an important factor in this for all of us is why we believe things. That so with the Eric Hunley interview, I sat there and you've seen the piece that I put onto that Tony Ortega put onto the Underground Bunker, because I wanted to give chapter and verse and explain why
Yeah.
I'm concerned about O'Neill's book. My concern is based upon him saying he has no evidence. And he repeatedly says that he has no evidence, that all he can prove is that Charlie Manson and Jolly West walked the same corridors. They were both at one point or another at the free clinic in Haight Ashbury. He can't even show that they ever met. And so I sit back from that and go, well, there's no evidence. I think that of all of the things that I've found out in my long and exasperating life, have lead me to one core idea which William James put forward, the great psychologist. He talks about noesis, the feeling of knowing, the being sure of things. And there are feelings of knowing that are based upon belief, and there are feelings of knowing that are based upon evidence. So when people in the comments after the Eric Hunley interview were saying, yeah, but we still believe O'Neill, it's sort of, what's to believe? Why is belief any part of this? Until such time as proven otherwise, you are innocent until proven guilty. And that approach to the world, saying, this is possible, this is probable, this is improbable, that's about what we've got in the world. And with the Manson family, it does look like a petty criminal who has all sorts of difficulties and problems, who finds out that he can command and dominate girls. Now, there's no particular history of him doing that. When he was pimp, he was rotten at it. It's only after studying
Yeah.
Scientology that he finds that he's now got this way of getting these girls to follow him. It wasn't something that
Yeah.
came naturally to him.
Gosh, that says so much, because during periods of earlier incarceration, Manson would be under the kind of wing or care of underground criminals, notable gang leaders, notable pimps who would entertain Manson with stories of how to do this and how to do that. And actually, even after spending time with hardened criminals that were doing that outside of prison, the most successful way of doing it was still not from the criminals, but from the Church of Scientology. Oh gosh, I read something a few months ago about the actor Danny Trejo being in prison with Charles Manson and talking about how he was like a greasy, scrawny little man who needed protection, but he could hypnotize people. So he used to and this might go back to what you were just saying about walking up and down the cells. He would hypnotize people um so that they weren't in the cells, and so the leader of the group would let him sleep at the foot of the bed, so there was like 8 of them to a cell, and his protection would be sleeping like a dog at the end of this leader's bed. So yeah, and it's interesting because I imagine that that was likely to be a Mexican Hispanic demographic of people that he was offered protection from in exchange for hypnotism sessions.
Mm. And curiously, his racism extended to Latinos. It wasn't just blacks. Of course, he wouldn't have said anything to the girls because he wouldn't want to upset them in
Yeah,
between
no, of course
raping
not.
them and
Yeah.
having them shag
And
whoever.
delivering their babies and all sorts of
They
other.
can't go to hospital. We're not letting any of that. And we'll call the baby Pooh Bear.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
wonder where Pooh Bear is now and what sort of life he's had.
Well,
Manson, I
there's a
think.
huge ongoing battle for the Manson estate, which I just think is ridiculous because they said that there was no way he could generate money whilst he was in prison, but people were just sending him money, because the world of true crime is like a weird, odd place, and so the music that he made when he was a free man generates money now. You can listen to it on Spotify. I don't know ethically if that's appropriate. Yeah, there's various different people fighting for his estate. One of his grandchildren, although his son was like, I don't want anything to do with this,
Mm.
or one of his children was just like, no, I don't even want people to know that I am in any way related to this person. So
I'm told that all of Hitler's relatives in the US have changed their surnames for some reason too.
I can't think why. No,
Oh.
it's a pretty distinct. It's not like Smith or Cook or something like ATAC. Again, that'd be one of those names that's pretty. I think it's pretty distinct. Not comparing you to Hitler, by the way,
Oh,
just to let
well,
you know.
let's just say you wouldn't be the first person. Um, no, and I was very surprised to find that there are indeed other people who suffer under the name John Atack, not simply even spelled and just an abbreviation of Jonathan, which is what's on my birth
No
certificate. But
way.
there's some poor guy who's a sound engineer who's from Oregon,
Oh,
and he's called John Atack. Oh, you see, now you've met these people. This is what's coming out.
I thought you were going to say, oh, so he's been called John Attack his whole life, but now I realize if you're John Attack and people think he's John Attack.
Well, and he's not the only one. There's a chemist called John Atack as well. So every now and then,
No.
academia.edu tell me what am I up to? I'm cited in 2,600 academic papers. They tell me, but I'm pretty sure some of it is me, but I'm pretty sure that the chemist is in there and probably has. And but the reason it's embarrassing because these poor guys have no doubt been harassed by Scientology at some point.
I'm sure that Ford was following me yesterday back from work. It's like, this is so strange. Am I being stalked?
It's bad stuff. So it leaves us with we absolutely need to understand what happened with MK Ultra, that was a disgusting and despicable program. We need to understand why, which was because they really believed that the Chinese and the Russians had followed up on Pavlov and had found ways of controlling people. Of course, Ron Hubbard only made it worse by publishing the brainwashing manual. And there had been so much debate about the authenticity of this ridiculous diatribe. And somebody came to me having written an article about it. I think might have been Steve Kent, somebody absolutely reputable. And I'm sort of, Steve, I interviewed 2 people who were there when he dictated it. Is that good enough? to say he dictated it. You know, the fact that Beria wasn't alive by the time it was meant to have come out, and that the university it happened at doesn't exist, and it's now, it's kind of like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's one of those, the American hard right still pass this ludicrous thing around. But Hubbard was very interested in brainwashing. In fact, he said we can brainwash faster than the Russians. I think it's 30 seconds to total amnesia. He's boasting about having brainwashing techniques. The Kennedy administration, he writes to Kennedy and says, would you like my conditioning techniques,
Oh
for your astronauts? And apparently Kennedy didn't want them. But he conceived his subject. I mean, in 1952, he says, we have ways here of making slaves. And then he says, let's make sure none are made. It's like, yeah, really. But he
Right. So
sees
that's
his
the same
techniques as
year.
brainwashing.
That's the same year that Jolly West first spoke out publicly against Hubbard. So is that the correlation? Is that the
No,
cause for?
these were lectures that only 38 people would have heard at the time.
Right.
They're now sold to all Scientologists for a vast amount of money. But they're crucial because in 1952, he lost the rights to Dianetics. He sold the rights to Dianetics and he hacked for $1 and he had to come up with something else. And he'd lost the book and anything. And there wasn't any revenue anyway, because in May 1950, this book's released. It sells 150,000 copies. To everybody's surprise, it's published by a medical publisher. It's what? And by the October, the publisher, Artsepos, has gone, this is fraudulent. He's lying. And he commissions Dr. Joseph Winter, who'd worked with Hubbard throughout the writing of the book. They were seeing each other every day for months. And Winter, still medical doctor, still really believes in this Dianetic therapy. But he's going, this Hubbard, he's an awful charlatan. So Sepos stops publication of Dianetics, the modern science of mental health, and replaces it with a doctor's report on Dianetics. Hubbard's lost his following. There's nothing going on, and things just go from bad to worse. So that by December 1952, first book in May 1950, he's got an audience of 38 people. That's it. But the good news is, having paid $500, quite a lot of money at the time, for 6 weeks, all they have to do is sit and listen to him. And at the end of it, they get a doctorate. Imagine.
It's not a bad deal. It's not a bad deal at all. Where do I sign up?
Yeah. Well, it's they actually bought a diploma mill, Sequoia University, which awarded a PhD to Hubbard without admitting that it was owned by Scientology. And I only found that out after I'd written Blue Sky. And suddenly there are these documents about, the Scientology Management Corporation or something had bought Sequoia University, which was a diploma mill. And away you go. A lot of smoke and a lot of mirrors. And when we're investigating it, we need to be very careful about what we're certain of. We need to be saying, what is the evidence for this? I got it with documents so that when I was first presented what purports to be a transcript from George Washington University with L. Ron Hubbard's name on it, saying that he'd got an F grade in molecular and atomic physics, a failing grade, I had to treat that with a certain amount of skepticism. I stopped treating it with skepticism long afterwards. It's 2015 before I got hold of a lecture that Hubbard had given on the 24th of September 1950 called Introduction to Dianetics, where he says, at George Washington University, I got an F grade in atomic and molecular physics. He would later claim to be a nuclear physicist. So we have to be so careful sieving the evidence. I've often talked with people who had a different account. Today I talked with Janice Gillum-Grady for the first time, which was great fun. And I said to her, this guy told me that he was coding telexes for Hubbard, and the coded telexes were going to the harassment division in the Guardian's office. And she said, no. He coded all of the telexes so that nobody would get into them. And he gave his instructions privately with nobody listening. to Mary Sue Hubbard. Whenever they were going to have a conversation, even the messengers had to leave the room. And she's confident enough that, you know, Mary Sue Hubbard was not running anything. Ron Hubbard was telling her what to do, and she was doing it. And it immediately brought that kind of Don Corleone thought to
Yeah.
mind, you know, that I'm just going to whisper in your ear, and now you go and do it. When you get caught, which of course she did,
Yeah.
then you'll go down and I won't.
Yeah.
And being the
There are no
greatest,
witnesses.
no
But I
witnesses.
still want to know what's in the rest of those red boxes because I bet it's some damning stuff.
Well, you know, a lot of material came out, and including, of course, Operation Freakout, which Tony Ortega has written so eloquently about in The Unbreakable Miss Lovely, which is, you know, there have been so many books written about Scientology now. I think I can still say that the only historical overview is Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, though Janet Reitman called her Inside Scientology the first modern objective history of Scientology. And then when you look to the reference notes, it's largely drawn from A Piece of Blue Sky or Barefaced Messiah, which was also largely drawn from A Piece of Blue Sky. So objective, it's objective because she's not an ex-Scientologist, but she's repeating
Right.
often what I've said. Now, even there, she gets facts wrong. I noted one erroneous fact per page, so I don't recommend
Oh
her book
gosh.
tremendously. Very sloppy. But nonetheless, that there are
I
hundreds
did
of
read
books.
The Bad Cadet though. I thought that was a fantastic memoir. And I'm so excited to speak um and talk about the juxtaposition between, you know, being a carefree kid and also working in a kitchen as a cook at the age of 8. Yeah, Katherine Spallino's got a great voice as a writer. So thank you for connecting us to
Mm.
one another.
I was very impressed with her. She contacted me and sent me a copy of the book, and I thought, well, I'll skim this and I'll do a show with her to promote it because I want to help people be heard. And to my amazement, I read the book. You know, it was so intriguing, and she is such a charming and delightful person because there's no venom in it. There's no bitterness. To an outsider looking at the terrible childhood she had in the 90s in Scientology, it's jaw dropping. You know, how can people, but to her, it was the life she lived. And she came away. But what particularly got me with Katherine was when I spoke to her, I said, so who have you approached? And she said, well, I came to you and to Chris Shelton because you don't seem intimidating. And I said, oh, have you been to Mike Rindo? She said, oh, no, Mike's a celebrity sort of thing. It's like, and it was, she's a, you know, she's a housewife with a couple of kids and, you know, very smart, very likable. And I think very honest, you know, that the book tells you, and I mean, I think it'd be particularly useful for anyone who
Yeah.
had a childhood within an authoritarian cult, because seeing the parallels there,
Yeah,
seeing
yeah.
how you're,
Especially the family separation is so poignant,
mm,
and the lack of communication between her and her parents to each other as well.
mm,
So yeah, it's a really really well written book, and I am hoping to draw that point. It's also for me coming from the position of not growing up or existing in one of these experiences. It's a really educational piece in that sense as well. It gives insight where, you know, it's not just I grew up in the Sea Org. You know, what is
mm,
the Sea Org? What are all of the different acronyms and parts of the Sea Org? What does that mean for, you know, what does that mean for children before they go to the Sea Org? What happens before? All of the stuff that happens
mm,
before, and then once you're there, all the stuff that happens. So that's what it's really really good for as well, is bridging that gap
mm.
between people that, you know, oh, I've heard about the Sea Org, but have you heard from this perspective? Because I imagine it's quite unique.
Absolutely.
I've interviewed a person that had their guardianship signed over to Scientology into the Sea Org. Her name was Kat. She was very young, but I've never read about it. And there's a big difference between having a 2-hour conversation with a person and reading about a person's life in detail. So um yeah, both are good. Read the book and
Mm.
listen to the podcast.
Yeah, and Janice Gillum Grady's book Commodore's Messenger um, is, there you've got the creation of the cadet org, because she's the
Wow.
first cadet back in 1968 at the age of, I think
Wow.
she's 12 by then, but she's on the ship at 11. And the Commodore's Messenger organization begins with Janice. And she, she tries to, I think she seeks to be fair, and she no longer believes in Scientology. Even she spent 11 years serving Hubbard and was with him most days during that time. But she seeks to be giving an accurate picture to the best of her ability. I mean, often
Wow.
in Scientology, there are things happening in the next room that you don't know about. So, for example, in her book, she talks about John McMaster's disaffection from Scientology. McMaster was announced as the world's first real clear. Hubbard had announced lots of pretend ones in the 15 years before that, in 1965. And she talks about his disaffection. I interviewed John at great length back in 1984. And the reason he left Scientology is very straightforward. Hubbard was throwing people overboard. It was still happening a couple of years on. And, back in Corfu, when they were there, they were actually, it's 25 to 40 feet, I'm told, the drop. And the high board in the swimming baths here is about 14 or 15 feet. So they were throwing people from higher than the high diving board. Many of whom couldn't swim. They'd have their ankles tied together so they could be pulled back onto the boat. They might be blindfolded. And talking with Karen de la Carrière last year, she said, yeah, and in Corfu, of course, all the ships let out their human waste
Oh gosh.
into the harbour. So you were being thrown into that. And this is the great,
Oh.
the future Buddha who will save all of mankind, Maitreya. But John McMaster was overboarded and he broke his collarbone on impact, and he was left screaming in the water for 2 hours. So Janice, even though she was thereabouts, didn't know that. So often it's like a tesserae of a mosaic. You're filling a
Yeah.
picture out and understanding things, which again brings us back to Manson, that it's important to get all of the evidence before drawing the conclusions. And that Charles Manson was trained in a system of mind control, a system that says it's a system of mind control. There's no contention about that. Scientology is about learning to intend other people to do things, which, if we take the language apart, it's learning how to perform magic. It's learning how to do supernatural things to people. And it, thankfully doesn't work. If it did work, we wouldn't be having this conversation now, would we? If Scientology had any supernatural powers, 40 years later, John Atack wouldn't still be making peevish comments about Ron Hubbard.
Do you know, I've also had the thought though, after he sold the rights to Dianetics, like and only had 38 people listening to it, imagine if it just fizzled out. We just also wouldn't be having this conversation.
and that
But a
would have,
lot of people would have been saved from so much harm, if only.
it's true, but as we go back in history, there are so many of these figures: Mary Baker Eddy, Madame Blavatsky.
Yeah, whose legacies, well, I don't know if it's a legacy as such, but whose influences still exist very much in the world today.
Well, there are no Nazis without Blavatsky. Her
Gosh.
Atlantis story is foundational to Nazi belief. And the pan-Germanism in Austria of the early 19th century comes straight out of it. Even though the Psychical Research Society, their first investigation was into her, and they declared her a fraud. So even people that really wanted to believe found out what she
Yeah.
was up to. But the influence lingers. People still talk about Atlantis as if it wasn't a fairy story that first appears
Yeah.
in Plato.
Yeah.
And
Theosophy has influences in almost every online new age spiritual community, everything to do with, mindfulness, going back to, self-coaching includes so many elements of theosophy. And Mary Baker Eddy's Christian Science is still like, well, it kind of goes up and down in numbers, but it's still, there are still people who are dying from medical neglect because they follow the teachings to the letter. um it's Yeah. So even if Ron Hubbard, even if those 38 dwindled to zero, there's nothing to say that it would have at some point resurged into oh, it's so weird to think of him having no money and having no followers. It's just like, you think about the worth of the church now, just in real estate, is wild in
well, and also in
comparison.
terms of branding, you just called it the church,
The church, yeah, the
which of
church.
course L. Ron Hubbard was very concerned that we should look to the etymology of words, and a church is a gathering of Christians. So when we say Church of Scientology, and when you track that one back, it's because in December 1953 in Camden, New Jersey, Ron Hubbard registered 3 churches. That's where it begins. He would repeatedly say it was other people. It was Burton Farber in February 1954 who first. So that was there was always a screen, but the registrations exist. When I complained about Janet Reitman earlier, I do mention these registrations in my book, but she opts for the Ron Hubbard story that it was somebody else that did it. The point is, you have the Church of Human Engineering and the Church of American Science. And the Church of American Science, we're actually told its purpose accidentally when somebody was making the Scientology dictionaries, these 2 600-page tomes of Hubbard's misunderstood words. We find Church of American Science. Somebody had found it in a tape and they decided to put it in the book. And it says that the purpose is to recruit Christians and move them on to something better, like Scientology. So the whole notion of it being a church has now crossed over, so that we have this per word, this nice word that we associate with them, but they are not in any sense of the word a church. So in fact, Janet Reitman and I fell out of this. She's coming back into this conversation. She contacted me and I sort of, when she was researching, and I said, look, I'll talk to you on background. Don't mention me to anybody. I will give you access to my significant document archive. But I noticed you use the word church. And she came back and said, many people believe it's a religion. And I'm like, no, that's not my point at all. It's a cult. Or whatever, but it's not. The one thing it's not is a church. It's not a synagogue. It's not a temple, and it's not a church. That was a deliberate manipulation to get people. It's like the ex-Scientologists will refer to Hubbard as Ron, LRH, L. Ron Hubbard. They will fit the pattern. They will keep on with that. It's a small thing. I call him Ron Hubbard. Why would I call him L. Ron Hubbard? It continues
That's
previous.
so interesting. That is
Yeah.
so interesting. I mean, I guess I say Church of Scientology because often in this work, or when I'm speaking to people about Scientology, and people are like, oh, well, I mean, what is Scientology? Well, first of all, it's tax exempt because it's considered a religion, and it's, the Church of Scientology. So I think I just fall into the habit of saying the Church of Scientology for, I don't know, irony. Because
Ex members call it the church. It's quite normal to call it the church. Almost everybody. Tony Ortega will call it the church. The word cult has become rather loaded, but calling it Scientology or the organization, if I'm in a mischievous mood, I call it the B org. Because that's the Borg, and that takes us to the one mind in Star Trek, But don't explain that to anyone. And I talk about members as being devotees, and people don't necessarily get where that one comes from, because that, of course, is Hubbard's developed unnecessary traffic, dev T, but with an O put into it, so they're devotees. and they do waste your time, that's for sure. So the definition fits, but it's loaded language that we fall into describing something in its own terms. And with Scientology, I mean, it does bother me that people think that being a religion is a good thing. So the thuggees who used to use datura like Manson and strangle about 4,000 or 5,000 people a year, that was religion. They worshipped Kali. The Aztecs, when they ripped hearts out of people, that was a religion.
Yeah.
When the witch
Yeah.
burning was going on and the Inquisition, these are religions. The term religion is just a term about a group of people getting together and having beliefs that bind them together, ligare, to
What you're going
bind
to say,
them.
and sacrificing people, because that
Well,
also
you
in a
know,
lot of
that, I mean, and there we get into all of the trouble with the process, and that Maury Terry's peculiar book and assertions about the network of satanic groups, and we
yeah.
find ourselves plunged into this thing. Still, there we are. I think we have aired some of the points, and we'll come back.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot, isn't there? I mean, my understanding of Jolly West is that there were hundreds of MK Ultra groups or
149 projects.
right. And Jolly West was overseeing one project.
Possibly.
So I don't know.
But let's look at the
Again,
nature of those projects, that because of course that immediately makes somebody sound dreadful. Anybody that was hired by MK Ultra, as O'Neill shows, would not be told, "Hey, this is the CIA's mind control program." They would be offered money. He traces it to Chemofrill. He found letters from Sherman Griffith at Chemofrill, and Sherman Griffith is Sidney Gottlieb, who's the head of MK Ultra. But there's no evidence that Jolly knew he was getting letters from anybody other than Sherman Griffith, whoever that is, and that Chemofrill was offering money. And of course, those 149 projects, yes, some of them were like, spraying cadmium on the streets and seeing who got sick, or erasing people's memories under the head of the World Federation of Mental Health, Ewan Cameron, in his Canadian asylum, was wiping people's memories with electroconvulsive therapy and isolation tanking. Terrible, terrible things. You wouldn't be told this. What you'd be told is, Jolly, we're really interested in the effects of LSD and we found some research money for you. You wouldn't know you were part of a scurrilous, despicable attempt to control and destroy people.
yeah. Well, I mean, to call him the architect of that is it's a bit, well,
He
I mean, it's
wrote
not a
the
bit, it's a
blueprint. He
much.
wrote the blueprint, O'Neill says. Yeah. And it, in talking with people, just simply looking at the way a psychopath is, psychopaths don't do things to help people. They'll do things so that it looks like they're helping people. It's like when Hubbard said, that he wanted Scientology to look like a charitable organization. And thankfully, they don't have tax exemption in this country, though they are recognized as a religion by the Supreme Court, but they're not recognized as a charity, quite rightly. So they pay all of the money offshore and never make a profit here, so they don't pay any taxes. They never have paid any taxes here, I don't think. But we have to get into the detail. We have to see what happened and to whom did it happen. Jolly did somebody came onto the comments at Eric's site and said, yeah, but what good did he do? And he kind of going, well, firstly, when somebody goes to court, it's not a matter of, well, you've got to teach us you've got to tell us what good you've done, or we'll send you to prison. You're meant to actually charge them with a crime and find them guilty using evidence, witnesses, documents, that kind of thing. But I pointed out that he received 36 honors and awards from universities and associations, a lot of it for his work on alcohol rehabilitation, helping people who'd had problems with drugs, and understanding those things better. He wrote 182 chapters and papers that were published, and he wrote or co-wrote 8 books and monographs. I found him unbelievably helpful He did everything he could. I was offered a PhD by Aarhus University in Denmark, and he wrote a letter of support straight away. And that's why I know how many awards and papers he got. Because I've got these. In fact, I've got it right here. I can wave it at the camera.
Here's my proof.
Yeah, here's my proof. Scan that. This is
Wow.
the list of Jolly West's achievements in life.
Oh my goodness. That is like the references you'd find in the back of a book.
Yes, it is exactly that.
Wow.
And he was fulsome in his praise. Which I first became acquainted with Mr. Atack after reading his excellent book, like the word excellent there, A Piece of Blue Sky, and seeking him out. I was greatly impressed with the thoroughness of his research, the quality of his writing, and the timeliness of his exposition. The book is now the definitive text on L. Ron Hubbard and the Church of Scientology. So, yeah, I do have reason to like the man.
Yeah,
no doubt
you're
about
not
it.
biased at all.
But I would defend, I hope, I would defend anybody who I felt was wronged. And I hope that the fact that I've stood up to Scientology for 40 years, despite everything, gives me a certain standing in the community to say, I will fight for what I believe to be right. And in this case, perversely, to some extent, I'm fighting for Charlie Manson's rights. I'm fighting for the right to him to be viewed as he was. And he was a truly awful human being. But I don't
feel
think
scapegoaty to say, oh, it was all just part of the CIA's MK Ultra experiments. It's like, oh, yeah, I don't know. I watched Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and the ending not being what and I didn't watch it for years because I know in too much detail what took place at Cielo Drive, and I was just like, I don't want to watch a
do
film.
you want
I
to see
know
that? Yeah.
Tarantino's notorious for having graphic, gory, overly dramatic fight scenes and things. And I
And
was just like,
sucking
oh.
women's toes in 4 films, apparently.
So there's so much toe action in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. But I watched it, and the ending playing out the way that it did, I didn't want to see the accurate ending, but I didn't want to see a fictionalized version either, because it kind of feels like, but that's not what happened. It wasn't a heroic fight scene where, the innocent people chilling in their houses fought back and won. Like, and it was next door to the pregnant woman and her 3 friends and Stephen Parent, that most people forget to talk about because, he wasn't a
Famous.
celebrity or somebody that was going to inherit millions of dollars. But I almost felt like their memories were cheated by the end of that film, because it was just so, I don't
It is.
know. So I
It is.
what I wanted from the ending, but it wasn't either of the things.
I mean, and there's so much else that can be said about the connections with Hollywood and celebrity because of Terry Melcher, um, Doris Day's son, who had produced Mr. Tambourine Man for the Byrds and made them super wealthy by basically telling 4 of them they couldn't play their instruments and bringing in a band to do it. We won't talk about that. But Melcher's girlfriend was Candice Bergen. So when one of the girls, I think it was Ruth Ann Moorhead, was offered to Melcher to take home, it was Candice Bergen who said, "Oh no, you don't." So she knew Manson.
Yeah.
And Dennis Wilson, of course, of the Beach Boys, associated closely with him. That there, so Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, this making a fiction of it, as you say, that does seem disrespectful to Sharon Tate and the others who died. On the other hand, it's Hollywood, and
Yeah,
that's the
that's
way they
true.
treat
That's
things.
true.
But
I don't know. There was just like this idyllic, like
yeah,
Pregnant Margot Robbie waddles out as Sharon Tate, and she's like, "Oh, are you okay?
mm,
Oh, some bad guys came over. Oh, why don't you come over here and have a drink with us?" And it's just like, I don't know. I just kind of felt like, oh, I don't know how I felt,
But
obviously.
maybe he was meaning it ironically, in the same way that you, when you use the word church, mean it ironically. But yeah, once upon a time, um, it, it's a
Yeah.
it it's a well-made film, and I must say, when I got to the end of it, I was relieved.
Yeah, yes, I think there is an element of that, isn't there? That's why I put it off for so long because I didn't, nobody wants to see that.
No,
Um, but I don't know. She was just, and like, who doesn't, wish so many different things, like, at least that she had her baby and that the baby was okay and the baby was safe. And there's so many different things, and she's just standing there at the end of the film and she's fine. And I was thinking, but she's not fine.
no,
Yeah, it's conflicting, but I think to sit down and look at everything and the various different books that exist and the different theories,
mm,
I just always go back to he was a criminal
mm,
and he was using everything that he'd picked up from all these different
mm.
people and books and all these different ways of manipulating and influencing people and trying to move everyone out to Death Valley where he could be even further like from anything,
Mm.
anything living at all. Trying to build dune buggies out of stolen car pieces and that 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 sounds crazy, but it still makes the most sense
Yeah,
to me.
yeah. A series of dreadful events took place, and people will forever be arguing who killed JFK. I think it
Yeah.
was Oliver Stone. Um, People will, all of the great mysteries, what happened to the Mary Celeste and what's going on in the Bermuda Triangle.
Yeah,
We
yeah,
are drawn to these mysterious things. Somebody in the comments said, "Look, it's all in the past. Why are you bothering with this?" And it's like, do you use your memory for anything? Because it's all in the past. What's in there?
yeah. No, I
Uh,
don't. I think when you go to visit certain um parts of
Poland.
yeah, and there are signs that say, the reason that this museum is open is because if we it's the famous quote, and I'm so uneloquent, so
Santayana. Those who do not remember history are doomed to repeat it. It was above Jim Jones' throne at Jonestown.
no way, was it?
Yep. And
Oh my gosh.
on the Jim Jones and the CIA, I talked with John Andrew Collins last week, who's looked into the William Branham Tabernacle with in great depth, and I did not know that before. I didn't know that Jones had been one of Branham's acolytes, and they split when Jones started bringing black people into his church, because
Yep.
Branham was also deeply involved with the Ku Klux Klan and had a compound in Chile where they dug tunnels into Argentina so that Nazi war criminals could escape. And you're going,
No.
this is a religion, isn't it? It's a religion.
Yeah, and how many branches have come from, the Branham movement? How many there's so many
But
different
the whole
groups.
Pentecostalist movement is, the origins of it. I think every pastor who was involved in creating Pentecostalism from Dowie onwards, they're all crooks. And so, I'm a big fan of the Righteous Gemstones. I don't know if you've seen it yet, but it's run to the third season now, and it shows the megachurch movement for what it is.
Oh gosh. I mean, that kind of brings us full circle, doesn't it? If we're going to be talking about people that claim to be born again messiahs, or reincarnations of Jesus Christ himself.
Or
Lots of these
representatives of
people.
God on earth. Yeah.
Yep, yep, and only they could interpret things because they are the only ones that can communicate with this divine being, which is just, you know, just so convenient for them.
Yeah, and 'twas ever thus that century on century you have people who are writing down their realizations, and we're believing them. And I'm with Jesus on this, that when Thomas comes along and says, I don't recognize you, Jesus says, put your fingers in the holes. I want to be allowed to do that, to check the evidence. And that seems reasonable to me. If Jesus said it was okay, I'd like to see the evidence. So until I see somebody raised from the dead, I'm going to be a little bit skeptical about that.
Yeah. Same with all things like ghosts and conspiracy theories, and all sorts of things. Yeah. I'm
I
glad
was
you remembered that quote, because I would have butchered it horrifically.
well, I quickly memorized it before we went on. I was fascinated when Richard Dawkins said that he wouldn't like to walk through a graveyard at night. It's like, so you don't actually believe any of the things you say, no. And there was a survey of atheists, 20 years ago or something, and they found that 80% of atheists don't believe in God, but they do believe in the supernatural. So, me, I just believe in Santa Claus, and that's the lot,
Yeah. And I won't hear anyone say anything about it.
No, good old Nick. Good old Nick. Anyway, this has been a pleasure and treat, and we'll do it again in a couple of months' time.
Yes, thank
God
you. Thank
willing.
you so much for the
And
conversation, for the facts, for laying it all out there, and clearing up things that are oftentimes murky and not clear. I appreciate that, and I appreciate your time as well, and for inviting me back on the channel.
well, always a pleasure, and we will talk again soon. So thank you very much, Kacey.
Take care. Thank you, John.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much. And away you go.